Hi everyone, welcome to this video. I will be showing you the Spring Boot and Dapper developer experience. And for that, we will be creating a very simple Spring Boot application. And then we will add the Dapr APIs on top of it to use the state store component. So let's get right into it. So first of all, start.spring.io. Let's create like a new Maven project in this case. And let's call it, my organization and then customer catalog. Right, something like that. Pretty simple. The standard, like the defaults, Java 17 or 21, and then the latest kind of like Spring Boot release. And let's generate this. Before we generate, we'll add a Twitter because at some point we will run this application in Kubernetes. So let's add that one, and then let's add the web, dependency here. There you go. So now we have the basics. We will just generate this project, customer catalog. It's downloaded into my download folder. So let's go there and I will copy this to code, Salaboy, and let's paste it here. We will unzip it and now, we have our Spring Boot project created here. Basic stuff so far. Let's go and do some coding. And for that, I will use VS Code. And for using VS Code, we can just, open a new window. And let's open the project here. It's a Maven project, so we will use the Maven integration here, and it was customer catalog here. So this is a fresh project, right? Like nothing besides kind of like the basic initialization code has been included. And that's why we will see here that we have a very simple POM file with just the basic dependencies, right? Simple Spring Boot application. If we go to source, we will see that there is, a customer catalog application. That's the Spring Boot application. And because I'm a little bit lazy, we will add here like a REST controller. And this is going to be exposing a couple of REST endpoints so we can interact with the application, right? This has nothing to do with Dapper. This is how developers will create their own applications. And before we start, first of all, we will need to define kind of like our structure, the thing that we want to store in this case are customers. So we will do a public record customer, and what we will have, like string, the ID of the customer, probably the name, and probably the email address, right? So that's kind of like our definition of the objects that we will be using. And then we will just expose two different endpoints. A post request mapping, public request entity, right? Response entity, sorry. Response entity, there you go. Customer, right? So that will be kind of like our first functionality. It will receive the customer as part of the request body, right? And customer. And what we want to do is we want to store it and basically return the stored customer. So return response entity, okay, with the customer in it, right? That's what we want to do here. Actually store the customer, right? The second thing that we want to do is we want to get a get mapping so we can get the customer by ID. Public response entity, customer, get customer by ID. And here we will have a path param here, and that will be the string customer ID, right? So basically what we want to return here, we want to return the same, right? Like we want to return the customer based on the customer ID. And that should be pretty much it, right? Like here, what we need to do is like we need to retrieve the customer from the store, right? So we just need to get that customer back. So definitely not that one. So this is definitely not it. It's path parameter, path no, request param, I think. Yeah, that's it. So we need to retrieve the customer. So that's kind of like our basic kind of like Java application. In this case, when we start this application, we want to have an endpoint. In this case, when we send a post request, we will just be sending the customer as part of the body. We want to store that customer into the store. and then we will get the customer by ID. When we send the customer ID in the request parameter, we want to go to the store and retrieve the customer with that ID and return that back. So pretty simple stuff. Next, we can just basically add the tests to make sure that this functionality is working as expected, something that developers will do. And for that, we already have a Spring Boot test created here, and we'll just store and retrieve customer test. There you go. So basically, what we want to do here is we want to send a request to store a new customer, assert that the request was successful, and then send a request to retrieve the customer by ID. Check that the body of the response has the same values that we submitted previous request. There you go. That's kind of like what we want to test here in this case. Pretty simple stuff. We want to store things and we want to retrieve things. We want to make sure that that's the same data and it's kind of like working. So in order to implement this, you have different options here. Like in the Java world, you can just go and add something like Spring Data and add a database to store this information. But in this short video, I wanted to show you the Dapper experience. In order to do that, we will need to add a new dependency, which is basically going to help us to interact with the Dapper APIs. And we will be just writing the code here in these two methods and the test to test the functionality to make sure that we are actually storing data and we're retrieving the right one. So let's jump straight into that. And for that, we will jump into the pom.xml file. This is the file that you use to add dependencies to your projects, and this is where we are going to add some of the Dapper dependencies specifically for Spring Boot and Java. Okay, so I will copy some dependencies just to add into this project, and we will take a look into those. So I will be just adding these dependencies now. Oh, don't do that. There you go. So basically what I've added here is this dependency, the Dapr Spring Boot starter, which brings kind of like with a bunch of cool things like the Dapr Java SDK, but also some test containers integration that we will look into in a bit. And then I added some, rest assured dependencies for testing purposes. We want to submit HTTP requests and then assert on the returns, like on the responses, and also build kind of like complex structures. So we will be using the rest assured and the Hamcrest matchers for doing these tests. So let's jump into the API side of things. When we added these dependencies here, we will be able now to interact with the Dapper APIs. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be using the Dapr Statestore APIs to store the information about our customers. And in order to do that, we can just jump in here and start coding and using those APIs. Okay, so to start using the Dapr APIs, basically the first thing that we will need is to create a new Dapr client. And we will do this inside the try catch block because it can fail, right? So let's create a Dapr client, and new Dapr client builder. Yes, so build. There you go. So now we have our Dapr client, and of course this can be catch. Yeah, exception. Something can go wrong here, so we need to be careful about that. We need to make sure that we catch that exception. And just in case for now, we will just print the stat trace and see what's going wrong, right? But if we have the Dapr client, the first thing that we can do here is we just can grab our customer and store it. And for that, we are going to use the Statestore APIs, which is client save state, and that's what we need. We need a store name. Okay, so what's that? That's the name of the store that we are going to use. And usually we will just take this parameter from maybe like an environment variable. So let's do that, right? So in Spring Boot, we can just use the value annotation to read environment variables or configuration parameters, right? So private string state store name. Let's use caps for this. Let's leave it like that. And then here we'll just need an expression, right? And that's going to be something like this. So if we create an environment variable with this state store name, and if the variable doesn't exist, let's call it state key value state store. There you go. So basically, there is a default value in this case key kv store, and if not, we can just set an environment variable to define that state store name. That might vary, that might be different between different environments, but that's just the name, right? Like the API will behave the same. Then it's asking for a key, and then the last thing is the customer object that we need here, right? That's the thing that we want to store. And here the key, well, we can get creative on how do we want to store these objects into the state store in this case. And we can do something like, private string customer key customer dash, something like that. And then we can use the customer ID for concatenating that, right? Like, so customer ID. There you go. So if we format this document, just to make sure that it looks pretty, we just implemented that functionality. We are just receiving the customer via the post request, and then we are storing it into the state store APIs, right? So how this is going to be stored, it will depend on how Dapper is configured, right? Like on the state store component that it's configured there. As a developer, you just don't care about all the implementation mechanisms. You just care that you can store state and you can retrieve it later on, right? Okay, so now if we want to retrieve the state from the state store, we will just use the same APIs, client get state, and you will see that there is one option here that basically asks for the state store name. Here, let's use the state store name from there. Then it asks for the key, which is basically the same key that we used before, which is customer key, but in this case, the customer ID comes from the request parameter. So we'll use it from there. And finally, the type of object that we're trying to retrieve in this case is a customer, right? So we need to specify that. So when we use these APIs, as you will see, these requests are asynchronous, right? So if we want to actually get the result and not get a callback, we just need to block for that result. So we'll just use block in this case, and what this gives us is basically a customer state. So we can extract this to a local variable, yeah, which is basically state customer, right? So customer state. To this state, we can actually ask the question, if we have a value, if customer state get value equals null, basically we haven't found the customer. There wasn't a state for that customer with that key. So we can actually return response entity not found field. I always forget about that. Yep, there you go. And then if in the other case we have some value, then we can just return a response entity with OK, the value of the customer state value, right? And there you go. So now we have a customer. And of course, if something goes wrong, internal server error as before. So we just implemented these two pieces of functionality. But these APIs will require Dapper to be running somewhere. If you create a container, deploy this into a Kubernetes cluster where Dapper is running, and you have a state store component configured, then everything will work. But what about the tests? If we want to run tests here and we want to validate that this functionality is working. Okay, so now that we have implemented our functionality, let's go and write some tests. And for that, we will need to wire up certain things to make sure that we're actually testing these APIs. But first, let's write using rest assure here and handcrest some of the matches and functionalities to send requests in these tests and to make sure that we are sending the same request that applications will send against these services. And for that, we will use this formula, like with body. That's basically we're going to send a body, request body here, and that will be our customer. And then when we submit a request, then we are going to assert something about that request. So that's kind of like the formula that we're going to use. And this is kind of like what Rest Assure help us to define pretty easily. So if we want to send, for example, a new customer, we will just send the body there. And the customer that we have defined here, like in our application, will need an ID. So for that, we can do something like string customer ID equals, let's generate it randomly, your ID, random ID to string. There you go. So we have customer ID for us. Then I will be the customer for this test, and my email is at mail.com. There you go. So we have a customer definition here. We want to make sure that with content type for the request is JSON, right? Content type JSON. So that's kind of like the type of the request that we're going to send. And then when, so this is like two sections. It's like with this kind of like a request body and with content type, when we submit a request to slash, it's a post request. When we submit a post request, then we want to set that, for example, that the status code is 300, right? That will be kind of like our first test. So we want to make sure that we send the customer, we submit a customer to a post request. I think that we can define here this path, so slash, right? Like when we send a post request to slash to a REST endpoint, we want to make sure that that request is accepted and the payload gets stored. But let's just focus into this for now. If we want to submit this request, this will fail because the Dapper client will not be able to connect to any Dapper instance because we are not running inside the Kubernetes cluster and Dapper is not installed locally either. So for that, we can actually use some interesting integration between Dapper and test containers. And for that, as you will see, we already have test containers annotation here because when we added that Dapper Spring Boot Starter SDK, we will just bring a kind of like test container with us and the test containers integration. And we will be using a feature that comes with Spring Boot 3.x that basically allows you to run the context of this test just for local development purposes. So let's take a look into how to do that. Okay, so what we will do now is we will just create a new application here, a new Spring Boot application in the test context to be used for our tests. And this application will be actually using the customer catalog application to bootstrap the context and allow this test to execute against the application itself. But we will be adding a couple of configurations there to make sure that Dapper is also initialized right besides the application so the APIs are available. So for that, we will just create a new customer catalog test app Java. Yeah. And for this one, we will also mark this as a Spring Boot application, and we will create a new public static void main, right? And this one basically will contain the definition on how to start our real application. Spring application from, and in this case, we will use the customer catalog application main method, and then run, right? So that's pretty much what we want to do. But in this case, as I mentioned before, we also want to include some test containers integration. And this test container integration is the one that it will include this Dapper configuration. So Dapper gets started right beside your application and provides an implementation by default for the APIs that we are using. So let's do that now. Okay, so now that we have like an application, a Spring Boot application that will be executed for our tests, starting the real application that we have defined before, let's add the Dapper configuration to this. And for this, we will create like a static class here, static class test configurations, right? Simple thing actually that will use some test container import test containers. And here we will use the Dapper basic profile class. to configure our application. So what we are doing here is we are importing using this test containers annotation, some configuration for our application to use when it's starting. And for that, we'll just need to include here as well, test configurations class. And of course, I'm forgetting here the arguments for the run args. There you go. So let's see if this works. So now when we start our tests, this test specific configuration for our application will be started. This will include Dapper. This is not something that we will need to configure when we're running in production. That's why this is only test scoped. And basically now our tests are going to be able to use this basic profile that provides some basic and in-memory implementations for the Dapr APIs. So if we take a look at our tests here, I think that we are just only missing a few things, like making sure that we use this application, in this case, customer test app class, yes. And then we need to make sure that we start the web environment with the defined pod, let's say. That's basically going to use that. And let's remove this, let's leave it there for a bit. Let's see if this actually runs. So I need to make sure that I save everything. Everything is saved. Yes, and then let's see if this test runs. So if you look into the output of this execution here, you will see that everything worked, I think. Yeah, everything kind of like passed. But you will see that whenever I'm starting my application, in this case for these tests, the Spring Boot application is correctly starting, like as normal. But then test containers is picking up and starting some containers, in this case, the Dapr sidecar that basically expose these APIs to the application. So you will see here that the container is started, and then, of course, the application context gets started, import 8080, and then we execute the tests, and the test works correctly. So basically now when we have test is that we can submit a request and that the request is actually working. You can see that the test is passing. Okay, so now let's submit a request to validate that the customer was stored correctly and that we can just get that by sending the customer ID. For that, we will use the same formula. In this case, we will not have a value, but we will have a parameter that it's called customer ID. Customer ID, yes, and the parameter value will be customer ID. That's it. And then we will just do the when side of things. When we send a request to using get method to slash, right? We can now then assert, then first of all, then assert that the status code is 200. Okay, we want that request to be successful, but we also want to assert that the body, in this case, the name is equal to Salaboy, right? And that the body email is equal to email. It's equal to salaboy@mail.com, right? So now let's run the test again and check that both requests are successful. So now the application is starting. Yep, tests are running, and yep, both successful. So we managed to store this customer into our key value store and then retrieve it by calling the get method on our application. The interesting thing about this integration is not that only we can just create tests against it. So now this is a fully functional application that is running with Dapper alongside whenever I'm starting the test, but also that we can use Maven in order to start our application in development mode, right? So if we clean this up, I can do something like Maven Spring Boot test run, and now my application will be actually running using this test configuration that we just defined in this application class here. So now, because I'm using the goal test run, it's picking up this application, which is actually starting the real application plus the Dapper basic profile that provides the Dapr implementation for the Statestore APIs. So as you can see here, the application is now running. That basically means that I can actually send requests to this running application, and mostly for like development, activities. I want to change the application behavior. I want to quickly test before even writing a test or whatever, and I can just start this application in this way with exactly the same configuration that my test will be using. So that's pretty much it for this video. I want to quickly show you in a running application how this Dapper and Spring Boot integration works. As a developer, probably you don't really need to know much about Dapper itself, just that you can just bootstrap this configuration by just adding this simple annotation, and then just learning a little bit more about the APIs that you will have available here. We have seen the save state and get state APIs for this very, very simple example. We will take a look at PubSub later on for emitting and consuming messages, and then the workflow APIs that it's a little bit more complex, but it provides very interesting functionality. So thank you very much for watching. Till the next time.